Good evening and welcome to Of United WFC with me, Matt Crane. It's our first Tuesday night live show on our YouTube channel. I'm joined tonight by Gareth, by John and by Natalie. Gareth, how are we doing?
Yeah, good, thanks, mate. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. John, yourself?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. Looking forward to this one, finally on YouTube and not Twitter. So let's see how we get on.
I know, we've made it finally. And Natalie, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing good, Matt. Good to be on tonight.
Lovely. Natalie's joining us on audio today. She's having a couple of technical issues herself, but bear with us and we'll still bring you the quality content that we do. Tonight's show then, obviously, we're talking player contracts, we're talking sustainability, we're talking treatment of players, women's football, sort of after COVID and the state of it financially, and a whole host of other things as well. So we'll kick it off with the news from sort of early this week regarding 3 players at Liverpool. Now, we saw the other day, we saw one player who was basically, she came out, it was Kirsty Lynette, and she came out and talked about her contract at Liverpool, and she thought that she was going to be offered a new contract and didn't. And basically her quote said, "My time at Liverpool has come to an end. I've seen a lot of similar experiences in women's football. Something needs to change. People need treated better. It's not good enough." After that, then Becky Jane, who's also a Liverpool player, came out and pretty much said she was treated the same. And then a day or two later, Amy Rodgers, another Liverpool player, also said the same. And it basically came down to that their agents got in touch with Liverpool to discuss signing a new contract, only to find out that the offer had been withdrawn by the general manager. So obviously what we'll do is we'll talk about that and then we'll move on to discuss other clubs. So John, I'll come to you first regarding that then. Obviously it was a surprise for us, but are you surprised maybe in the fact that it's Liverpool and it's happened before? Or was it still a shock, that they haven't learned from sort of past experiences?
Yeah, well, like you say, it's a bit about it, isn't it? Because obviously, not surprised that it's Liverpool because it's happened in the past. But you'd have thought that by now, with all the press, all the bad press that they get across women's football, that they would have learned from it. But from what I took out of that, we've heard a lot about mental health in the past couple of weeks, with it being like last week was Mental Health Awareness Week. And one thing for me, when it comes to people's mental health, especially around work, it's sort of about job stability, and it's very hard and uncertainty around the workplace. And to me, like we talk about contracts, the length of contracts, that is a huge part of it. 3-year contract in the women's game is massive, but like a 1-year contract or a rolling contract it must always be playing on the back of your mind. So to kind of like not even be a 1-year contract, so it was almost like going to negotiations or going to the summer thinking that you may be staying, and then having your whole life turned around because you might have to relocate, you might have to move away from your family, you might have to start spending more money to live elsewhere or wherever. But again, that uncertainty, and that's going to play on your mind, especially when you don't earn as much as maybe some of the other players, which we could maybe talk about a little bit later. I just think of the players regard, I don't think anyone deserves that anyway when you're playing football, but now that's going to be on their mind more than the actual playing the game yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to come to you next, Gareth. Obviously, I'm assuming you saw it as well. Do you think this is something then that obviously maybe that the club as a whole not only needs to look at, but also possibly the FA probably needs to intervene based on the fact that, it's happening quite a lot?
Yeah, I think that the issue at the moment is security across the board. One-year contracts are the norm, and like John said, there's no way that you can go and build any sort of job security on that. If you look at Aurora Mickelson, for example, signed for United last year on a 1-year deal, got released, signed for Spurs on a 1-year deal, has been released again. And that was a big commitment to move from Norway to the UK to try and play. And, it's been 2 kind of 1-year deals. So I think that there needs to be the clubs need to be held to a higher standard with regards to the way that they're negotiating deals. And, it's it's part of football. Contract negotiations contracts will get withdrawn when the offers are there. That will happen kind of across the board. If players go in and say, no, we don't want to sign for that amount of money, we want this amount of money, and the club aren't prepared to do it, then negotiations will break down. That's part of the game. But I think what we've seen with Liverpool is that these negotiations haven't taken place. There's been an offer from Liverpool. The agents have gone to start negotiations, and the club have just pulled it straight away without speaking to the player. And I think, clubs need to be, they're professional clubs, they need to act like it. And I don't think that's what Liverpool have been doing with those examples. And I'm sure it's not just Liverpool that are doing it. I'm sure that other clubs will be behaving in a similar way. I think the FA need to have a standard that they hold clubs to, because I think what Liverpool have done over the past week has fallen short of that, which is acceptable of a professional outfit.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you talk about sort of the word professional outfit there. And I know when these clubs, and Liverpool are one that are a professional club, there's certain conditions within that licence they have to meet in terms of, player contracts, finances, player welfare. And it does seem now, for what seems the third year in a row, they're kind of going against that. Nat, I'm going to bring you in there and sort of link in with Craig's point here as well, because I know you know a couple of Birmingham fans, and sort of, probably a little bit more than the three of us on the situation there. Are you maybe surprised that it's happening more often now, it seems, and maybe you could possibly shed a light on a little bit of sort of the struggles Birmingham have had?
Yeah, I'm surprised because I think, we knew there was issues. It's like what John says about Liverpool. Everyone knew there was issues, and yet they still seem to be happening. As far as I'm aware, what I heard from Emma when all those happened, she sort of said it's as if they were going to stay, but then Matt Beer came in and obviously changed his mind, which is well within his right, but then it's led to them not being told, them not being informed, and then they're obviously assuming that they're going to stay, and then that's happening. In terms of Birmingham, it's like what we said about holding a standard, and I know Craig will probably know better than me of what's going on there as well. But just from what we've read, what's come out, there is a license, there is a criteria where that due to this you're supposed to have sort of full-time staff, but apparently that wasn't the case. It was just Carla Ward who would train them, and then someone would come in on match days to be an assistant in that respect. We saw pictures of them in the. They had that porter cabin for injured players, but then look at our own club as well, Man United. There's a tent put up for a gym, no toilets, and I think everyone is so desperate to have a women's team that we're just grateful that there is one, rather than, well, this isn't good enough, this is a standard, and this should be the standard, and if you can't meet the standard, you shouldn't be in the league. And I think we are now getting to the point where I think could come in, because we're seeing more teams in the Championship becoming professional, and I know Leicester went up, and there's talk now of 3 more teams that might be made professional. So if the team can be made professional, it should, and I'm really a big advocate of that. But I think definitely for the WSL there has to be this raised standard now. I think the Championship, if it's going to be, we're hearing talks 2 fully professional leagues or hybrid professional, that's great. That's what we want to see. But for me, I think the WSL should then be, like you said, with this money coming in, there are sponsors about other teams. Championship teams are getting big sponsors as well. So I think there should be like maybe a minimum of, well, I think as well with the Liverpool thing, it's decency. You expect someone to change their mind, but it's the decency of it. It's the respect, and I suppose you can't really put that in a contract. But I think definitely things like what we said, full-time professional staff, all that kind of thing, then there should be there. And this ain't no slight on Birmingham. I know they're having issues, across the board, but I think the FA needs to sort of say, we've had this league 10 years now. What's the next stage? And I think some kind of raising a standard, raising a bar, maybe even 2-year minimum. Everyone has to be on a 2-year minimum contract. That things like that written into the WSL license would be beneficial, and I think the fact that we have like licenses as well, it just encourages sort of people maybe to oh, this is the bare minimum, so I'll do that rather than, So I think if people want to do that, let's raise that bare minimum then.
Yeah, no, I agree absolutely. I think like you say, standards are there or should be there, should I say? Not all clubs, but some, aren't sort of abiding to those standards, and I think it's very interesting because, I mean, this is a great comment. I love this about pointless putting a women's team there if it's not done properly and looked after, especially if you haven't got the funds. Now, obviously, we appreciate. Not every club is linked to a men's team. Not every club has the funds. However, it's absolutely spot on. I think at times for me personally, it feels like sort of box ticking. I don't know if you want to sort of build on this point, Gareth, and I'll sort of let you talk about that, in terms of funds and things, and just build on what Nat said as well about professional standards. But it's something that we do need to see, don't we, if we're going to improve the game as a whole.
Yeah, and I think all of the clubs in the WSL and the Championship, apart from maybe Lewis and Coventry United, have no excuse in terms of investment, because the clubs are earning hundreds of millions of pounds a year in investment. If Coventry United can seek the commercial deals to go fully professional, when their women's team, and the same with Lewis as well, their women's teams are operating at a higher level than their men's teams are. I think Lewis is step 3 in the men's game. I could be wrong. And Coventry United, I think, are step 5 and potentially in non-league. So, if they're able to seek that investment, get that commercial opportunity and go professional, then there's no reason why, especially clubs like United, can't be putting the money into the club. I think, I said before, I hate bigging them up, but if you look at the way that City have handled their women's team, the infrastructure's there. The Etihad campus is a fantastic facility. They've got their own base there. They've got their own stadium there. Yet, granted, they share that with the academy. But the academy stadium's great. Chelsea have bought Kings Meadow from AFC Wimbledon, so they have a home there. Villa and Leicester have top quality training facilities for their women. So I think there's no excuse for these clubs to not have that level of investment. And when we talk about minimums, there is a minimum expectation that players will be on a 16-hour-a-week contract. And obviously that's going to apply predominantly to those that are part-time, which I suspect is 2 evenings and then the match day that they're paid for. And it's vague in the sense it says a level of investment. But what is that level of investment? That's kind of where the transparency needs to come in. What is the level of investment that we're saying is a minimum? And I don't think it should just be a flat number. It shouldn't be you need to invest X amount into the club, but potentially there should be a minimum in terms of the club's income or a percentage of the club's financial sort of incoming should be kind of reinvested into the women's game. And in that way, that clubs like Coventry, again, for example, aren't going to be held to a completely ridiculous standard, and Man United are allowed to get away with things. 1-year contracts, I think, are part of football in general. Cavani was on a 1-year contract for the men this year. They can offer, they can be, there in terms of strengths and weaknesses for both the players and coaches as well. So I don't think there should be a minimum of 2 years, but when more money comes into the game, that's when we'll start to see kind of more security and longer contracts, because you can take that financial risk on players. I think the reason we see a 1-year deal with an option so often is because if you look at, there are players at United who have got multi-year deals, and, are we going to be able to shift them on when they should be going because they're tied into this contract? And people aren't going to pay money to release them from that contract. So that's why the 1-year deals are there. And I think if we sort of talk about finance and COVID, there's an article that you sent me that shows that 80% of the income for Man City in 2019 was commercial. Only 6% of that was match day. So in terms of COVID, the fans not being in the stadium isn't going to have had a great impact on the club's finances. That's not what's going to have done it. It's going to be losing that commercial money.
Yeah.
And that'll be lost because the circular flow of income in general is down. People are spending less, and then companies are less willing to invest that money because they need to invest it elsewhere. So sponsorship, I think, is going to be down. And I think it's probably going to take a couple of seasons before we see that back up to where it should be. And that is what is so important for these clubs. And I think that's probably why you see certain clubs have separate shirt sponsors for their men and women. Everton have a separate shirt sponsor for their men and women. The women aren't sponsored by Kazoo. I can't remember off the top of my head who it was. But yeah, I think when there's more commercial opportunities become available, we'll start to see more money coming in. Hopefully a TV deal from Sky as well will put more money into the system, and then we'll be able to see clubs being able to take a bigger financial risk on players. But I think it's kind of a vicious circle at the moment, in that as the game's still growing, it's growing at a rate where we want it to be held to a high standard, but the money's not quite there to be able to take those risks on contracts. Look at Leicester, for example. All of their players this year are on a 1-year professional contract. If they'd sign them all down to 2-year deals, then there's going to be players that aren't going to play in the WSL next season that they're spending money on. Whereas, they've now been able to refresh the squad and be able to get a squad that they're effectively spending their money on next season. There's no wasted money hanging around. So I think we're in a bit of a grey area at the moment in terms of how the game is growing before we see proper contracts being offered out.
Yeah, some very, very valid points you make there. I'm going to sort of bring you in, John, just to sort of, comment on what Gareth said. And also, I want to touch on something that was something Nat actually tweeted that I saw earlier today. She was talking about, and it's similar to what Vix has said here, about Barcelona keeping the majority of their squad together. And I think Nat had said it was something like, a 3-year process, and basically they didn't have a huge turnover of players. And then, similar to Vix there, they've come back and won the Champions League, having lost, previously to Lyon. And also Karen talks about it here, about, it must be a little bit easier for a manager if players aren't constantly released. So do you just want to talk about that, and obviously just add to Gareth's points as well, because it's interesting. He talks about sort of, the finance and clubs maybe not being able to afford longer deals.
So both Gareth and Natalie mentioned about more revenue coming in with like maybe the TV deals and with the women's football growing. Absolutely. But how about the money that's being lost due to COVID? So I'm not too sure how much money it is with the men's team. I think from what I've seen in women's football, from something that you said earlier, Matt, something like about 100 million across women's football. 100 million for these clubs is huge. So first of all, Gareth mentioned sponsorships. Absolutely. Merchandise and all this kind of stuff, all this kind of revenue as well. We just effectively think, what's the contingency plan now for these clubs? Where are they going to start pulling some of this money back from? So, yes, I can certainly see there will be more income this year because of TV revenue, but it would be nice to get some kind of clarification on the money that's been lost. Where actually has it been lost? Is it the actual clubs that won't have as much money, or is it like the FA that's supposed to be pumping in some money or whatever? I've got no idea, but. For me, I just don't see loads of money being spent on long-term contracts just yet, when there's so many reports about them like kind of losing money. I don't know if Gareth and Nat wants to touch on that after I answer your second point, but Matt, about the stability of clubs. So for me, when it comes to players in and out, I appreciate that women's football is a lot different to men's, but for me, we saw it with the men's team. Chelsea brought in so many top quality players and they just couldn't settle. That's obviously on the men's game. Women's game, I appreciate it's a bit more different, but it's one of those where if it's not broke, don't fix it. So, I'm a big believer that you should only really tinker with the squad and just do it gradually. Some teams might be in a real tough position, but a lot of the top teams aren't, and they just need a bit of tinkering. So hopefully. That's the way I would like to see a team go. And all these rumours about so many Man United players going this season, It does worry me. We spoke about Man United's long-term ambitions and short-term ambitions for next season. Me personally, I think we're going to struggle to get top 3 next season because the amount of players who's got to come out and the amount of players who's got to come in, it's just far too many.
Sorry, just taking Natalie out there. Her battery's gone on the phone. Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's very interesting. You talk about that. And I think similar to what Gareth said about finance, it's when they're obviously, looking for longer term contracts, I think in order to make it sustainable, you do need sort of that financial security. And I think, in terms of that coming, it's going to be quite slow. He talked about sort of revenue being the main sort of bulk of income. And without fans and sort of visibility and the advertising and sponsorships and things like that, you're not going to get that unless, it improves, or unless you are attached to a big club like a Chelsea that can afford to take the millions of pounds worth of losses that they do. Because let's not forget, women's football clubs don't run at a profit. I'm pretty sure in England there's not one club that does. Chelsea and City running up losses. We are, Arsenal are. So it's one of those things for me. But I think, do we think then, I'll come sort of back to you, Gareth, do we think that, if we do eventually get to these sort of 2 and 3 year deals, will that lead to better treatment, do you think, of players? We might not have a sort of a Liverpool and a Birmingham situation if the money's sort of, there.
I think it will inevitably, because there's not going to be that same lack of security. And, I've worked on fixed term contracts for a year. And the first 6 months of the year, so from September through to about February half term, have been great. And after February half term, you're thinking, well, what am I doing next year? Do I need to start looking for other jobs, or is my contract going to get extended here? So, and I think that's going to be the same with the girls as well on 1 year deals. The season's you're going to get into the back end of the season, and there's going to be that doubt in their head that. Where are they going to be in August? Where are they going to rock up to pre-season next year? And I believe that a lot of these players that have been released have known about this for a while. Majority of them, anyway. Not necessarily Liverpool, but Spurs released a load today. Villa released a load. Reading released a load. And I think, inevitably, when you are on a longer-term contract, you have that security. And the treatment of players will be better because you'll be just, even if it's just because that negotiation is taking place 33% less than it has been previously. So I think it's difficult, and I think in negotiations there's always going to be power plays. And I think at the moment in the women's game, the clubs probably have a lot of the power. Whereas I think in the men's game, the power lies with the agent. I don't think we've got that same kind of power dynamic in the women's game yet. But who knows, if Jay-Z keeps signing up young players, then, I can't see Liverpool going up against Jay-Z when it comes to contract negotiations. So, I think, there's a long way to go with it, clearly. But I think it will get there. It's just all comes down to money again, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And just before we sort of go on to, you mentioned the money side earlier, John, but John, do you think with so many players going on freebies then, because obviously, there is this sort of shortage of money, do you think it maybe harms the game in terms of growing it at this sort of present time? Because obviously clubs aren't making money. And I saw a tweet the other day, I think it was from that Soccer Donna that was talking, we talked about the figures and the rumours. And they were sort of saying to somebody, that basically players moving on a free, they thought in their view, meant that clubs don't make money and they're going to be more and more and more debt unless somebody bails them out. And sort of the replies in the conversation to that was, more clubs could potentially fold if clubs don't try and at least move players on to make a profit on those free signings that they brought in, however big or small. So what's your stand or your view on that?
I can see two sides to it, to be honest, because what you just said there, Matt, I do agree with that, absolutely. And I hate it when, say, for example, I'll talk about the men's side again, but I see more of it on the men's side where they purposely let their contracts run down As Gareth said, the agents are more in control than the actual club. So that side of it I dislike. But look at it from a player's point of view, from the women's team, they might want more options. Like, for example, they might want the options to go to a club that maybe wouldn't be able to afford her if they had to buy out a contract or actually buy her. Whereas if it's got on a free, she might have more options. So I suppose look at it like that. It does work out better for them maybe. But I always like to see players get sold. I like players to have value. I like to see how much they sell for. And obviously, yeah, you are right. It is if a player's going, then it should be down to value, because no one likes to go on free because you feel like it's just wasted, don't you? You're just giving one of your best assets away. So I can see two sides to it. And for the game, I think it's a bad thing, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with you, John, as well, because I know you, like I say, you mentioned it earlier, you were talking about sort of player wages, and there was a survey, wasn't there? It was actually Alex Colvin, who used to be a footballer, and she's now a senior lecturer at Salford Uni. And she sort of said, didn't she, about players' average monthly wage. Do you just want to go into that? Because you were quite surprised. We had a conversation. You thought it was a week, and then it turned out it was a month. Do you just want to sort of touch on that as well?
Yeah, so I think it was something like 3,300 people players were kind of asked, or you found out 3,300 players, and it was £450 a month, not a week. Now, I was thinking a month, okay, that's about two. I was thinking, if it's £450 a week, £2,000 a month, that's okay. For professional football, you'd expect more, but obviously this is going across semi-professional as well as professional. And to me, I'm baffled by it. Obviously, it depends on what clubs were actually asked and all that kind of stuff. But you talk about, we spoke on this show before about dual careers and the trouble that these players are having. £450 a month, they're basically doing it for free as a hobby, aren't they? And the amount of respect there that the players should have, the fact that they're playing for free just for the passion of the game, but they don't have that respect because people watch the games and expect them to be world-class players. Well, how can they be world-class players when they're obviously semi-professional, if that, and they've got everything else going on in their life as well? It's absolutely shocking. 2,000 a month, like $450 a week. I was like, yeah, that's okay. At least you can live on that. But $450 a month is, I think, is very, very harsh.
I think, and as well, to add to that, I think it said that was only professional players as well. So you're pretty much talking WSL and a very small number in the Championship. And I think the semi-pro players are just given expenses. So again, probably things like petrol, food, and anything else really, any other expenses they incur, which just shows, doesn't it, that these contracts, you can see why players, when they get a 1-year contract or even a 6-month, because let's not forget when Spurs got Alana Kennedy last summer, that was until January, and it was only in January when they give her another 6 months, and it's kind of like, she'd come over from Australia, so you can already see some of the issues from a player's point of view regarding sort of financial security. And like Gareth said, he sort of talked about with his job teaching, and it's exactly the same for me. You're offered these 12-month contracts, and then I'll have a conversation with you, John, sort of slightly away here from football, but you are offered that, and then it's kind of like you get to sort of March, April, and you kind of think, well, what next? Because you don't know if you're staying on. And I'd imagine football is exactly the same. Obviously when I worked in football, it was in men's football, so it was a completely different ball game because the money was there. But in terms of the women's football, it's not there, and it's a very short career as well.
Matt, just touching on that. So obviously, I spoke a little bit earlier about like mental health and job security, job satisfaction. For me, one thing I look for is, to make sure that your job's safe. And I know, I spoke to you, Matt, about obviously what you do away from YouTube and away from supporting Man United. And obviously, you yourself, and Gareth, I think you touched on it a little bit at the start of the show. It must be playing on your mind. Now, obviously, you probably feel comfortable doing what you're doing because you've done it for a number of years, so you're kind of used to it. And maybe the players are used to it, but how much better would they feel if they're under contract for 3 years? Even 3 years, I'll be like thinking to myself, okay, what am I going to do in 3 years' time? But at least you've got a bit of time to think about it. But 6 months or a 1-year contract or the potential to extend, for me, you've always got it in the back of your head. So how can you settle down and play your best football when when you've got that on your mind.
Yeah, it is difficult. I'm sort of gonna, I'll let Gareth sort of come to that as well and chat a bit about sort of like we talked about the pro and the semi-pro. But another thing as well, it's interesting, obviously, to note is that there's very little, in some cases, no maternity pay either, which again is another sort of issue. And I know Gareth, you'll be able to talk about probably the central contracts as well, if you want to sort of add to the points in the central contracts for countries.
Yeah, I think those central contracts are so important for those players, and that isn't an issue that's specifically women's football. I know in men's professional cricket, there are central contracts there, but the system is more elaborate because you kind of got the different formats of cricket, and then you've got developmental contracts as well. So, but yeah, in cricket, the ECB pay Joe Root, Jimmy Anderson centrally. And obviously that's the same in women's football as well, which I think has its pros and cons. Purely from a job security, from a financial element for the players, it's great. They'll get that additional income that means that they're able to kind of do what it is that they enjoy doing. Now, whether from a footballing point of view that's good or not, it is by the by. I think the reason we see players like Jill Scott and Steph Horton still picked regularly is because they've got that central contract. But I think once as a player you get that, that's then when you've made it to a degree, particularly for those English players and American players as well. That's why the American players will stay in America, because the specifics of their contract with US soccer, I think, are specify they need to play a certain amount of games in the US within a certain period of time. So that's probably why Lewis and Lavelle have gone back, why Heath and Press will go back as well, because the clubs just can't compete with the associations when it comes to that. So in terms of the security from the job, I think they're great. I think it's fantastic. It means that those good players don't get lost. But yeah, whether or not, from a footballing point of view, you think they're good or not, I think is slightly different.
It's interesting as well, because obviously those central contracts also depend on your country. You talked about America there, and they'll obviously pay top whack because they're probably the best, sort of country out there in terms of the women's football. But obviously it gets difficult, sort of, imagine if you were at, let's say, a West Ham, and you probably, you were a player that wasn't in the England squad, for example, and you're not getting that extra money, and you may be on a low wage. It becomes difficult, doesn't it? And sort of like you said, John, it becomes pretty much the love of the game. I mean, okay, they're still getting paid, but it's not great. And obviously you can only imagine sort of second, third, fourth tier as well, when there is completely no pay in sort of third and fourth tier, that it literally is for the love of the game. I think the other thing as well that was difficult from sort of this paper by Alex Colvin was that, there was a lot of clubs, especially sort of second tier semi-pro and third tier downwards, was that furlough wasn't an option. And then what happened was their contracts ran out during the lockdown, and the club weren't in a position to offer them new contracts. And I think, again, that's very unsettling, because it could come to the point where, you're completely out of football. I know there's a couple of players at Watford, Helen Ward being one example, had to get a loan to London Bees because she was saying basically she had like a job to run. She wasn't getting paid because they didn't furlough her at Watford. There was kids involved as well that she had to sort of homeschool. And it's just having, or had she had some sort of, security within a contract, she might have been in a better position, sort of off the pitch, so to speak, as well, which could have helped her again massively. And I'm sure there's other players in the same position where, clubs couldn't furlough them. And then it was a sort of a balancing act between trying to work and trying to sort of provide and keep your family ticking over. So it's an interesting situation. I want to going to move on then, John, and talk about, you were talking about sort of the mental health side. So I'm going to touch on that. Obviously, again, comes down to a bit of everything, doesn't it? The lockdown, working conditions and things like that. depression and anxiety. Do you just want to talk about bits that you'd read on that? Because I know another person who used to play for United, Alan Tong, he's also written a few things, hasn't he, on this, and sort of how it will affect the women's game going forward. Because, you talked about that loss of money before, which in the men's game is nothing really, but in terms of the women's game, that could literally leave us behind for years to come, trying to play catch up with that loss. Do you just want to sort of touch on that bit then?
Yeah, so obviously there's lots of things that could obviously touch on mental health. For me, some of the things that I see and hear a lot of is people kind of players like being almost like alone, whether that be players from abroad coming over, whether it be, I'm talking more about this year, for example, players having to move away from their family, whether it be in this country or abroad. When they are alone, how are they then treated by the club? So we're okay at Man United because obviously we've got a good setup there. And I remember Casey saying during lockdown that they had a special team to actually keep in touch with the players and talk about nutrition, talk about extra things away from football. But obviously some players haven't got that. There's just so much that you could touch on when it comes to like people's well-being. When it comes to health as well, a big chunk of it is mental health. So a lot of the things that disrupt players is all mental and not necessarily all like physical. So for me, the amount of things that we've seen and read on Twitter is just more needs to be offered, more help needs to be offered. And again, is that down to the club? Is it down to players' agents? Some have all players even got agents, at the lower tiers? Who's helping them? Who's providing the support? And I'm a mental health champion at my company that I work for, and it's a big thing for me. And that's because, I'm constantly speaking to people that's got mental health issues of all different levels. And the first thing I try and do is give them support or give them ideas of ways to support. And I don't think that from what I'm seeing that it's respected enough in football. And the reason why I'm talking about football in general is because it's so high profiled that there's in the spotlight. And I just think that because they're in the spotlight, it puts more pressure on them. And there's just so much that can be done that I just don't think that we hear enough of it. So if it is being done, I think we need to shout about it more. And then if we do shout about it more, it opens up more avenues for support. So for me, definitely something that needs to be done. But I like to know what actually is being done so we can kind of not brag about it, but kind of put it out there so people who do need support can actually get it.
Yeah, Gareth, we'll sort of lead into you because I know you had things as well based on this.
Yeah, so I'm going to use cricket as an example again because it's the other sport that I spend a lot of time involved in. I know the England team in the last couple of years have started having a sports psychologist go on tour with them. So whenever they go to, for example, the Ashes this year, the England team will probably go to Australia in November for a warm-up. And then they'll be in Australia probably until the back end of January. Some players maybe have a short-form tour afterwards and will be there maybe until February time. So that's sort of 4 months away. And a sports psychologist will go with them. And when you listen to people like Jimmy Anderson, who've been in the squad since they were 18, 19, when they first broke in, the concept of that would have been completely alien, and there wouldn't have been these conversations. And you see players like Freddie Flintoff developed bulimia, and a lot of that is as a result of the media when he was playing for Lancashire. I think there was a documentary he did, and one of the things he mentioned was a splash from the newspapers, just like Fat Freddie. And so he developed an eating disorder, kind of not because of that, but it contributed to it. But now it's a lot more open, and the players are willing to go and speak to this psychologist and speak to each other. And I think it requires a complete culture change. So it's not going to happen overnight. But it's going to require that the clubs to invest in that. And I think that every club should have a sports psychologist working with them. whether it's on a full-time basis or whether you imagine that United and City could probably work with a similar psychologist within the Manchester area. But I think that every club should have that. And when more clubs start working with it, then the culture will start to change. And as those players come through, it will just be the norm. And it may take a while for some of those more established players to kind of get on board with it and really embrace it. But I think it will happen. And the cricket rules, you just hit the ball hard, run backwards and forwards. That's about all there is. But yeah, I think it requires a complete culture change, and I think we're getting there with it. We've started that, but it's not a problem that is isolated within football, let alone the women's game or sport. It's a complete sociological, societal problem. And yeah, we are making progress with it, but more needs to be done, for sure.
Can I just ask Gareth? Do you think, because you just touched on it there, do you think that's the way to go with some of the less rich teams, where you do have like an independent psychologist who then travels to different clubs or players go to them or whatever and do it that way? Because obviously, if players can't afford to get paid, then I'm sure psychologists can't afford to get paid by a club. But do you think that could be the way where either like the league kind of pays for it, or clubs pull their money, or I don't know how it would work, or sponsorship or something? Because to me, that sounds like a good idea where one can go to like a numerous different clubs.
Yeah, I think there's no reason the money that the FA get in, if the FA are going to run the WSL and the Championship, which at the moment is what they're doing, then they can probably afford 100K for a couple of sports psychologists that can work across the league. And if the clubs want to bring their own one in-house, then then clubs like United, City, Chelsea will be able to afford that. But to use Lewis and Coventry as examples again, they could tap into the FA's resources and use those. And you imagine if there's 2 sports psychologists working with the Championship, well, that at 1 club a day, roughly, that they'll go and spend time with. So I think, there's definitely options there. A couple that could work centrally with the FA, because, I'm under no illusions that clubs like Lewis and Coventry, where, 50, 60K is an awful lot of money for them. But clubs like United and City, that's nothing. I don't think the Glazers and the City owner would even notice 60K if it fell out of their wallet. But I think that could be the way forward.
It's interesting actually, because I'm just thinking now, and sort of reading about things in the comments, about this. It's interesting because you mentioned clubs, Gareth, and I'm thinking, as well as clubs. And similar to what John said about affording it, maybe then it should be the responsibility of both clubs. If they can afford it, should be told or made to have one as part of the license. And then if the FA had a couple of general ones, so I'm just thinking back to them comments from the 3 that left Liverpool, and they were saying, it's like literally it's, end of May, transfer window opens 11th of June. And they're now scrambling around because they thought they were getting a new deal, or they were open to signing a new deal, only to find that actually, it's been withdrawn. And I think, clubs have a responsibility to encourage the players or to help the players with emotional support, as do the FA, like you said, of it being, their own game. And I think another thing is, if the FA have their own, even if it's one that everybody can use, I think that will help when players do sort of leave clubs. Because, these players, let's say there was one at Liverpool, these players may not feel that they can now go to that sports psychologist having, left the club. I mean, that's not to say that, they wouldn't help. I'm sure they would if they turned around and said, although I'm leaving, can you still, offer me support? Pretty sure that would happen. However, it's something that, they might need to consider going forward, especially, we talked about sort of security earlier on within the game. And I think it's interesting as well. There was like again, I'm linking back to sort of this article that was put out there from Alan Tongue and Alex Colvin. Thief Pro did a survey with 1,600 players, and I think it said from March 2020 to March 2021, anxiety and depression in female footballers and male footballers doubled in 12 months. And it was things like being away from home, contracts as well, the amount they were paid and things like that, support being withdrawn. So it's quite interesting, obviously, how this has obviously not only just impacted players, but also, impacted contracts and seems to, go on, John.
Can I just ask you as well, because I think it would have been you that mentioned it. While we're talking about mental health, obviously a big thing at the moment is obviously what people read on Twitter as well. Have I heard you say that certain clubs, or maybe United, I don't know if every club's got one, has got some sort of coach there regarding social media? Or
yes, that kind of ties in with this. So United have a psychologist, and they have somebody that does social media and media training with the players. That happens, I believe, once a week. City do as well, because I know, again, there's a lot of young players there. So obviously, even just, away from social media, even like media after the game, for example, and interviews, things like that, they have training on that. So it tends to be common in your bigger clubs, similar to, what we were talking about before about like finance and things. But I think if we didn't have that, or, for the clubs that don't have it, it must be very difficult, because it's like, where do you go? Some clubs stay off it. Some players rely on it to promote not only themselves, but the game, because again, things like finance might dictate advertising, especially lower down sort of the league or the leagues. So, yeah, I mean, it massively varies. And I think this is part of the sort of interesting discussion. And it's a reason, why we look to do a show on this, because for me, it seems like not only has COVID had an impact on what we can see in terms of budgets, but behind the scenes as well. And, it's not always obvious unless you're a massive club, sort of how big the gap is. But it was interesting, because there was a comment that I was quite shocked by that somebody put out there. And it was about sort of the working conditions at their club. And basically this was a tier 3 player. And they said, unsatisfactory working conditions in women football is common, particularly in tier 3 for players and staff. So not just, the players, but the coaching staff as well. It says players are expected to feel grateful from this particular club. I'm not going to name the club. Players are expected to feel grateful for the opportunity to be playing football. And I was shocked was, the first thing that came to mind, because why should somebody, be expected to feel grateful for doing something they love? I mean, okay, clubs don't have the money, but to come out with comments like that when, it's the club's responsibility to at least try the best with what they can afford, was quite shocking, really. And something that, took me by surprise. But yeah, I just thought, that was interesting to touch on. I'm going to sort of move on now to the final part of the show, talking about, fans getting back, and when we do get back to grounds, hopefully in September. I'll start with you, Gareth, then. Do you see the sort of the makeup of the crowd, shall we say, being the same? Do you think people have reservations, or do you think players may even feel pressure when fans are back, because obviously they've missed them for 12 months?
I don't think they'll necessarily feel pressure. I think they've missed the fans being there, and I think it'll be strange to begin with. But I think what we'll see is a lot of home wins in the first couple of weeks of the season. I think in terms of the makeup of the crowd, we'll see something pretty special. If you look at Southampton played against Portsmouth in the a local cup competition at the weekend. The exact name of the cup, Hampshire Cup, potentially. And there was about 1,300 fans there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that was record attendance for those for that competition. So I think if clubs like Portsmouth and Southampton, who, all credit to them, they're not big clubs in the women's game. if they're attracting attendances like that, then I would expect to see bumper crowds in the first couple of rounds of the WSL as well. They probably won't be record-breaking weekends because those weekends have been massively skewed in the past with games at the Etihad or games at the London Stadium or Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. But I think we'll see people who just want to go and see football again. I think there's going to be a lot of United fans who want to go and see football again. I think it's unlikely we're going to see a full Old Trafford in September. So, yeah, I think people just want to go and see football, and that option's going to be there. So I think that, I think we'll see some good attendances early on, and I think the players will respond to that well. And I think, we'll see quite a few home wins. And I think we saw the impact of that in the men's game at the weekend. I don't think Villa would have held on against Chelsea if there were no fans there. I think Chelsea would have been able to bounce back and get the win. But I think the Villa fans carried the team over the line in the last 15, 20 minutes. So it'll be interesting to see whether come September, when things have started to lift even more, if things do lift more in June, whether that desire to get out and start doing things again is still there, or whether the novelty of going and doing something has worn off by that point.
Yeah. John, do you want to sort of talk about this? I mean, it's a good point that Craig makes. Hopefully teams don't increase ticket prices due to sort of the losses. And I know Gareth, I think, mentioned, was it 6% you said earlier about the revenue? But again, it's something that, we saw, I think, was it Tottenham the other day, £60 to go and watch their game. And they were put right at the back of the stadium, and you just think absolutely outrageous. You talk about, or the men's game, they certainly talk about, the fans mean a lot, but it's just empty words. At the end of the day, you're a customer, whereas you'd like to think the women's game's a little bit different, don't you, in terms of the landscape. So you just want to build on that point then and sort of give your thoughts on it.
I'm glad Craig's mentioned it, because I think this might have been mentioned on the thing that you sent us earlier, Matt, as well, and I forgot to mention it when I was talking a bit about the lack of money due to COVID. But I just think one of the selling points for women's football, especially when you're not used to women's football, if you're new, wanted to get into the game, is the ticket prices. Now, obviously, it goes up like £5 for a season, an extra £5 for a season ticket. Maybe it's not the end of the world. It's still a decent size percentage, but you could probably still afford that. If you could afford £40 for a season ticket, you could probably afford 45. But if it starts to be doing that, like obviously lower down the leagues as well, which maybe the teams that probably need the money the most, then you're not going to encourage people to go to the local team, are you? And for me, who wants to learn more about other clubs and more about different tiers, I've got a club right down the road, and I've got people on Twitter that I want to follow. Can I justify spending any extra money on these clubs when probably not, to be honest, because the only reason why I would go is because it is quite cheap. I think it would be completely wrong if to do that, because you're punishing the fans, and it's the fans who's been punished as well by not being able to go into the ground. So I think it's the wrong way of looking at it. If you're going to increase anything, I suppose it needs to be like merchandise or something like that, or getting money from elsewhere, like from extra sponsorships, or working harder that way. But to kind of punish the fans, make them pay extra after not being able to go in for the last 16 months, I think would be completely wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sort of links back to this, are they cutting the budget? In terms of Man United, I mean, obviously we can't say for definite, but we had heard, didn't we, prior to Casey sort of leaving, that, she did say she was on a reduced budget. So I'd assume most clubs looking at sort of that and finance are, working with less. And it's one of them, isn't it? Because like we talked about before, in terms of the impact of this on the men's teams, it's not huge. I'm pretty sure they can cope without 100 million. Whereas the women's, game, it's got the potential to completely kill the whole lot there with that. And I think that was a loss, wasn't it, that the FA suffered? So obviously, bearing in mind the FA running it, the impacts literally going forward could be huge. But it was interesting. I know obviously Gareth talked about the Hampshire Cup final, Portsmouth against Southampton, and I think was it 1,300 fans attending or just short. And it's it shows, doesn't it, that there is a scope for it to really pick up. And I've sort of had this conversation before, and I said, I wouldn't be surprised to see record attendances because fans haven't been in. But it was interesting the point you made, John, about affordability. Were you saying with your local team? Because I think at the end of the day, most people, they watch their own team, but are football fans and will watch other teams. And I think it's something that we've done here. Certainly me and Gareth have, and I know Natalie's been and watched sort of ex-players or players out on loan, and you want to be able to do that, and you want it to be affordable. And like you said, John, you don't want fans to sort of be on the receiving end of that. And I think if they do that, they'd need to, for me, seriously think very carefully, because you don't want to drive fans away, especially when they've not been in for 12 months. Fans could easily just walk off and say, I don't want anything to do with it. It's cheaper in the third tier, or it's cheaper in the fourth tier, or like you said, they might have a local team. I mean, I've got a team near me 5 minutes away in the fourth tier. It's not great, but you think, if that's affordable, why not? I could probably walk there, so I'd save the petrol and things like that. I mean, listen, that's extreme, but you see the point I'm trying to make there, I think.
And also, Matt, we've got a great opportunity to increase awareness for the game now that it's got going on Sky TV and BBC.
Yeah.
But as soon as people start watching it at home, instead of going to games, maybe if they enjoy the coverage, they won't go back to the stadium. So that's always a risk as well, isn't it? Now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, and this is a good point here on screen about the Lionesses game was £20, and people are going along even if they don't follow women's football. And for me, that's what it's all about. That's how kind of I got into it back in 2014. One of my friends went, and he was like, "Oh, do you want to come?" And I was like, I kind of watch it on telly, and I didn't even know the prices. And I was thinking it'd be similar to the men's. I was like, can I justify 20, 30 quid on one game that I'm probably not hugely enthusiastic about because it wasn't my team? No. However, he said, it's a £5. So I thought, well, you know what? It's not my team, but, forget it. For the sake of £5, it was football. So it just shows, and I think that's going to play a huge part. And, John, you mentioned the TV deal, again. But I'm going to sort of, before I wrap it up, I'm going to ask you this then. Gareth, in terms of fans returning then, do you think the media as well has a big part to play in terms of, getting fans back in, and obviously everybody making supporters, one, feel welcomed and two, safe?
Yes and no. I think the media have a role to play in increasing the attendance of the women's game in general, COVID or non-COVID. I think the desire for people to go and watch football is going to be there, regardless of whether or not the media are on there or not. I think what's going to be critical is that if you want to find the coverage for your team or for the league, then that's there. And I think we had Emma on a couple of weeks ago, and what she's doing is fantastic. You can log on to the BT Sport app on your phone, and there's women's football there on the homepage. I think stuff like that is going to drive fans there. People see, of course, the top of the league, so I'll go and watch that, go and see what it's all about. Or Leicester have just been promoted, we'll go and watch that, go and see what it's all about. I think, but what's really going to drive fans is if clubs promote it properly. We saw the Etihad attendance, for example. I think United's promotion of that was pretty dreadful. But City went out and promoted it, and they gave away free tickets, and they got people in. So I think the clubs have just as much to do as the media. But I think the desire is going to be there for people to go and watch football. It's about how the clubs, I think, more so than the media, tap into that and encourage people to come through the door.
Yeah, absolutely. Cautious of time, so what I'll do, John, is obviously let you explain your show, which is coming up on Thursday, and also just for those that may have missed yesterday's show, to talk about sort of the fan forum on Friday then.
Yes, so I was going through the whole week then. So Monday will always be me, Matt, Nat, and Ben, unless if one of us can't make it, then we'll try and get somebody else in as well. That's usually a match reaction show. Obviously, over the summer, we'll just talk about some of the breaking news over the weekend or any transfers, ins, outs, anything that's topical at the time. Tuesday, obviously, we've got this show here. Wednesday will eventually be the Nat show, or whatever she's going to call it. She's got some great ideas. Please tune in to last night's live show to kind of hear her explain it, because she's really passionate when she talks. Thursday we'll stay on the main channel, the Awful United main channel. That will be me, Natalie, and probably like the special guest of the week, whether that be a journalist or a fan or whoever. Friday is a new show. We trialled it last week through Twitter Live, and it worked really well. It's an opportunity for fans to come on and discuss what they want to talk about. So every fan who comes on, up to 6 people, can bring a topic to the table that they want to discuss. So they can either talk themselves about that topic, or they can open it up to the other 5 guests. So that's a Friday night fan forum. And then Saturday, as always, the Ben and Matt show. You're back live this week. You had your pre-record last week and got some good numbers there for a pre-record show. So yeah, plenty to be tuning in for. And then when we do go back to the stadiums, Sunday match days, we'll be talking about the starting lineup, we'll be talking about the half-time analysis, loads of things to be discussing there. So basically, there's a show every night of the week going forward. So it's really, really promising and great to see.
Yeah, and obviously on that, and on Thursday, obviously you joined this week counted by Rich Laverty, and I noticed in comments, there's quite a bit on transfers. So we weren't ignoring your comments. We do get a lot, but what I will say is, if you tune in Thursday and you want to talk transfers with Rich, and obviously you, John, and Natalie, go for it. Ask away. I know there's a lot of people saying, when's this happening and when's that. We know they're outgoings and we know they're coming. And then it's just a case of, getting a new manager in, and getting the incoming sorted as well. And obviously, like you said, fan forum as well. I did say yesterday about, you don't need the experience. And, again, we welcome new faces on there to chat football. And you break it down, don't you, John? So people chat for 10 minutes. So it's great for those that, want to come on and chat. Like I say, if you've not been on a show before and you're a little bit nervous maybe, or you're not too confident, get involved with that. It's only sort of a short thing, and it's a really good opportunity there. I'm going to thank you both before we go. Sorry, John, did you have
I was going to say that the topics can be a memory of a game. It can be about a specific player. It can be about a player that you want. It can be something generic, like Andy Slater came on last week and he said, how do you measure success? We had, I think, Zoe asking about how's Leah Galton going to feel now Casey's left. It could be absolutely anything. So even if you don't know too much detail, you can break it down into any kind of question or topic that you want.
Yeah, brilliant. Absolutely. Right, I will leave it there. Thank you to you both for joining me, and to Natalie as well. I know our phone ran out of battery, so she had to disappear. Thanks for everybody as well for joining in the comments and for tuning in. And we'll see you Thursday at 7:30. Cheers, guys.